Good afternoon. My name is Sarah DeVasher Wisdom, and I'm the President and CEO of Greater Louisville, Inc. Thank you for being with us this afternoon for the first of 5 important conversations. The formation of GLI's Business Council to End Racism is an important first step to eliminating racism and building an inclusive economy that benefits everyone. Cultural diversity plays a key role in economic growth, and that is evident now more than ever. Expanding inclusivity and working to overcome implicit bias will require deep exploration of how racism has impacted and continues to impact our region, as well as intentional and meaningful action to ensure prosperity for marginalized communities. In the coming weeks, GLI will unveil our 5-year strategic plan and the priorities we have elevated to support and develop talent and businesses of underrepresented enterprises and people of color. As GLI launches these dedicated strategies and resources, presentations like today's will help inform and shape our work. So thank you to our friends at the Cincinnati Regional Chamber for being with us today and for your willingness to share your terrific work so that we can learn from it. To the council members joining us, I look forward to the post-event discussions we will host later today in the inclusion work stream. A special thanks to our event and council sponsors. We have our series supporting sponsors, Morales Group Staffing, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Tops Magazine. Series event sponsor, the Oliver Group, and our Business Council to End Racism sponsors, Brown-Forman, Humana, and Yum Brands. Lastly, thank you to our presenting sponsor, who you will hear from shortly, Papa John's International, for making the DE&I series possible. We value your support. Now I'd like to turn it over to a member of our executive committee and our inclusion workstream leader, President of HJI Supply Chain Solutions, Conrad Daniels. Conrad?
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, beautiful people of Louisville. Today's program is part of a larger conversation on how we must come together and work towards lasting change in our community. I've been a part of GLI's year-long work of developing and refining the goals and metrics of our 5-year strategic plan, and that also accounts for the establishment and accountability of the Business Council to End Racism. In my dual leadership role between the strategic plan and the inclusion workstream, my responsibility is to ensure GLI's implementation of strategies are methodical and intentional. As Sarah outlined, this is the beginning of understanding how our business community can take actionable steps to eliminating racism and promoting connectivity, diversity, and inclusion, which is all rooted in identifying solutions that support educational and economic initiatives affecting our marginalized communities. These actions must include a focus on intentionality to ensure we all succeed. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you for participation and willingness to put in the time and input to inform our work. We can't move fast enough, and there's a lot of work ahead. For many of us, there's a sense that this is the first of acknowledging the existence of racism in our community, and it feels like voices are being heard for the first time. Action and accountability is why I signed up to lead this. GLI is the convener, but what are we, you all out there listening, as a community going to do next? Let us make sure when we look back 5-10 years from now that we can say we have made significant steps. So how many majority companies and corporations are willing to adopt mentor protege programs specifically for MBEs? Adapt diversity benchmarks for team members, executives, boards, leadership opportunities. How do we hold all of us accountable to deploy diversity benchmarks? Will companies make their supplier base look like their customer base? Essentially, do we have an appetite to be transparent with numbers so that we can drive change and accountability? It's not about shaming. We don't want anyone to retreat. It is acknowledging we must do better. So let us move forward to ensure we don't stay where we are. Let's unearth these barriers and the systemic inequalities within our own organizations. By doing so, we can earn trust through transparency, and that leads to accountability. Thank you for attending today's program, and we hope you will join us in this important work. Up next, I'm turning it back over to Sarah Davishire Wisdom.
Thank you, Conrad. On behalf of Papa John's, I'd like to share a few comments. Papa John's is excited to hear from our peers at the Cincinnati Chamber, which is also known as the Inclusive Chamber, right up the river from us. Darren Redis is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Minority Business Accelerator. Prior to joining the Cincinnati Chamber, Darren served as founder, president, and CEO of Main Street Inclusion Advisors, LLC, a national advisory and entrepreneurial development organization specializing in connecting and preparing underserved populations for high growth entrepreneurship and the emerging innovation economy. With him today is Audrey Treasure, the Vice President and Executive Director of the Workforce Innovation Center within the Cincinnati Chamber. In her role, she has established the center as a central place to support companies in solving challenges, recruiting new sources of talent, and implementing inclusive capitalism practices within businesses to benefit their organizations and to support the people they employ. We're excited to learn from you both and hear about your programs. Now I'll turn it over to Darren and Audrey.
And good afternoon, everyone. Certainly just really excited to be here and to share with all of you just something that frankly has been a passion of mine for quite some time. I'll just give a real quick backdrop. I'm relatively new, if you will, to the Cincinnati region. I joined the chamber in January of 2016 from Cleveland, Ohio, but was very familiar with a lot of the work happening in Cincinnati. And as was referenced in my bio, had spent quite a bit of time in the economic inclusion space, and particularly in my own consulting practice, sort of bouncing around the country. And I was looking for, frankly, a model that I could perhaps take a lot of my experiences and then how might I help to leverage that model and inform work more broadly. And so that has certainly been able to play itself out with a lot of things happening as we speak, which we'll get into here in our conversation. For those that may not be aware, and I'll get into some of this, the Minority Business Accelerator was actually birthed out of Cincinnati's own civil unrest back in 2001. And really an opportunity trying to then solve for economic disparities by growing larger scale African American businesses, and the Hispanic population was added some years later. I'll fast forward here momentarily, but the origins of our model, born out of civil unrest, at a time where we now have national unrest. We are also in the process of launching a playbook that we'll also talk about in short order. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I've been coached on how to put this together, but we'll see how this comes. So bear with me 1 second. See if I can make this work. And let's see here. Can everyone hopefully see my screen? So I think we're good to go here. So again, thanks again for just allowing the opportunity to share. I'm going to go through the formal piece of this pretty quickly, turn it over to my colleague Audrey so we can then dive into some healthy Q&A. The mission of the accelerator from inception to today is to accelerate the development of sizable, keyword sizable, minority businesses and strengthen and expand the regional minority entrepreneurial community. Sizable is further defined as businesses that have at least $1 million in annual revenue, a B2B or B2G business model, and the desire on the part of the entrepreneur to scale further. We have, and that is an important piece in that a lot of entrepreneurs may get to a certain level and it creates the right lifestyle for them, which is great. But we were also looking for folks that really wanted to become multi-million-dollar businesses. The current state of the accelerator fundamentally is about 42 high-performing companies that in the aggregate do about $1 billion in aggregate annual revenues, have created about 3,500 jobs since this work began, and there's about $1 billion of regional minority spending taking place. I was brought on, as I mentioned, in January of 2016 to fundamentally try to take this work to the proverbial next level. And so we ultimately defined that as growing by an incremental $1 billion in aggregate revenues and creating an incremental 3,500 jobs, so essentially doubling what I inherited. To do so, we identified 4 sort of primary work streams or pillars or efforts, if you will, that allow us to get to this $1 billion of growth, of which we're about 2 years into this plan now and tracking very well. And we do this in the spirit of what we call grow, build, attract, and create. And I'll talk about each of these 4 pillars in more detail. But fundamentally, grow is essentially, let's grow the current companies that we have of size to their next level. So if they're already doing, say, 10 million, how do we grow them from 10 million to 20 million? And so lots of tactics up underneath there, but fundamentally, grow is about growing the current portfolio. Build is literally building a pipeline of emerging minority businesses that we do in collaboration with a group called the CNBC. We'll talk more about that. Attract is a collaboration with our mainstream economic development group in town called Ready Cincinnati, which is really trying to attract minority firms to the region in gaps where we don't have minority firms. So for example, we'll identify a minority business in another market and how might we incentivize them to do business in Cincinnati in hopes that with a sufficient level of business that would incentivize them to put an office in Cincinnati or expand in our region. So it's really more about expansion than it is any sort of relocation, really more about expansion. And then finally, create minority firms, which is getting a ton of traction. This is literally taking a look at non-minority firms, if you will, mainstream businesses with no succession plan, no kids in the company interested in taking it over. How might we identify credible minority buyers to acquire mainstream firms of some size? So this just gives a little bit more detail on the grow bucket. And I won't spend a ton of time here. We have a lot to dig into as a group, Audrey and I, but fundamentally the accelerator at its core consists of, you see kind of to the left here, the portfolio firms and what we do for these companies, all rooted in a comprehensive business assessment. And it's really about creating capacity and readiness for capital, readiness for new business. And then on the right side, very detailed work with our corporate partners, helping them identify spend goals and spend analysis for those that want to further enhance and understand the business case for inclusion. We'll help them do that, but ultimately helping them also source diverse firms from our portfolio. And the accelerator fundamentally serves as a bridge between those two worlds. I mentioned the pipeline building bucket. And so you see on this screen, the organizations that represent what's called, again, the CMBC or the Cincinnati Minority Business Collaborative. Think about this in many ways as a sub-ecosystem of a broader ecosystem, but minority serving organizations all working collaboratively for a shared mission and shared outcomes. And in this case, that means basically identifying at least 10 high potential minority firms a year or 50 over 5 years. High potential being defined as companies that can become $3 to $5 million businesses in 3 to 5 years. But these are folks that are under $1 million today, but we believe have high growth potential and the ability to also perhaps create 15 jobs or better. I mentioned the attract strategy in collaboration with Ready Cincinnati. And so fundamentally, we try to identify, broadly speaking, when our mainstream economic development team goes hunting for businesses, understanding what that broad-based profile is. So in our case, businesses of at least in this particular pillar, let me back up. Actually, the core profile minority business aside, for when Ready looks for businesses to attract to the region, they generally have to have at least $20 million in annual revenues, operate in certain NAICS codes that align with our regional strengths, so manufacturing, aerospace, chemicals, etc. So we comb the nation looking for minority firms in those same buckets and at that same revenue threshold, and fundamentally serve as a lead generating source for Ready to attract those sorts of businesses led by entrepreneurs of color to the Cincinnati region. And then finally, the acquisition piece that I mentioned that's really getting a lot of traction. We partner very closely with our area banks and accounting firms and law firms, as their very clientele is the clientele that we're trying to get access to in terms of, again, mainstream, if you will, non-minority firms, small mid-cap companies, anywhere from a couple of million to 20 or 50 million, but that do not have succession plans. And how can we identify in the region or outside of the region potential minority buyers and literally create minority firms of size, as opposed to trying to grow everything organically. Depending on the report that one may read, there are literally trillions of dollars in play nationally from the standpoint of mainstream businesses without succession plans. So what a phenomenal opportunity to perhaps create minority firms as part of this national wealth transfer that's already underway. So we're super excited about the work taking place there. So I have much more to add to that from the standpoint of the playbook that I mentioned that we'll talk about, as well as a fund that we're also looking to get off the ground. But I want to now turn it over to my colleague, Audrey Treasure, to discuss the Workforce Innovation Center.
Okay, thank you, Darren, and hello, everyone. Nice to be with you today. I'm also gonna do this right. Hope that's right, and hope someone will tell me if it's not. So like Darren, I'm also pleased to be with you today to share with you a little bit more about the Workforce Innovation Center. This is a rather new initiative. We launched it in January of 2019, and I came from a separate business serving entity called the Cincinnati Business Committee and the Cincinnati Regional Business Committee, which are CEO-led organizations in town, where I had the opportunity to work on a number of community-wide economic development, education, and one key initiative that was focused on childhood poverty, which has led us to where we are today. So our summary is that, as many of you probably know, and as was acknowledged in Conrad's initial opening there, capitalism is not working equally for everyone, and that we have many disparities across the community. Poverty is one in particular that has been a challenge for the Cincinnati region, and there are disparities across lines of race that are holding our community back. We believe in a pretty simple premise that companies can serve a vital role through their own business operations to help not only their employees to survive and thrive, but also improve that company's financial performance and overall outcomes. With everything that's happened in recent months around COVID-19 and this heightened focus on racial inequality, companies now are seeking resources to make decisions and make changes within their organizations now. So what the Workforce Innovation Center has done is created some assessment tools to help companies identify where they currently are and any potential issue areas. We've got more than 120 practice recommendations and local partners we can make to help companies solve those challenges. And we're in the development of some sort of formal recognition process for companies to be recognized for the things that they're doing and the progress that they're making. We've got a vision that Cincinnati is a region that is known for how the business community engages with its employees, which result in long-term success for themselves and for their employees and the community as a whole. And we've been putting this into practice over the last year and a half. A little history for you, and you might have heard this, that a few years ago, the Cincinnati region had the second highest child poverty rate in the nation, which was not a statistic Cincinnati wanted to be known for. And so a few things happened. There was a formation of a group called the Child Poverty Collaborative that tried to look across the community to understand what was going on, what was driving that. And this very simple premise emerged that children are not poor in a vacuum. Children are poor because their parents are poor, their families are poor, and they're poor because they're not making enough money. And they're not making enough money because they are unemployed, or they are underemployed, or they are overemployed, meaning they have to work multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. So if companies could adopt more inclusive practices and contribute to economic mobility of their workforce, that could be a long-term goal for reducing poverty in the region, and that it would also be a business case for their own innovation if they could do things like reduce turnover and increase productivity. So after we launched an employer roundtable a couple of years ago that wasn't as successful as we had hoped, some business leaders developed the Workforce Innovation Center, and I joined the chamber in 2019 to start it. I've got an advisory board of business leaders who help to guide the work. We're growing this right now, and I'm really grateful for the guidance that they provide. And I'm also really pleased that we were selected, along with Mayor Cranley's office, to participate in an economic mobility initiative called the What Works Cities Economic Mobility Initiative. It's funded by these big funders here, and they provide us some resources as well as some technical support that has helped us to build our tools. A couple of those partners are listed here. We're really grateful for their work. And I should say that we started all of this in 2019 when we were in a good economy. And part of what we were saying, part of our pitch to companies last year as we were building out these tools was, hey, you need a competitive advantage. You could, if you reduced your turnover by 10%, what would that mean for your bottom line? And in reducing your turnover, helping to make people more financially stable, you're doing something for the community as a whole overall. So the pandemic hit, and we weren't sure what companies' appetite was going to be, or really what the world would look like. But as things has evolved, we have seen this renewed urgency for the work that we do and the reason for why we do it. With significant racial unrest, companies now see themselves as a part of the solution, and that they have an opportunity and an obligation to make some things happen within their own organizations, to address disparities and to improve from where they are. You've seen this called lots of different things. We refer to this as inclusive capitalism. That article there refers to greater capitalism. It's a Forbes piece that ran earlier this summer. We're also calling it humane capitalism. There's conscious capitalism. There's stakeholder capitalism. But there's this definite movement around how can capitalism evolve to better meet the needs of today. So what we're asking companies to do is engage with us and commit to a big picture set of principles and ideas, as well as use some of the tools we've developed in adopting some new inclusive practices. And then as appropriate, consider forming a cohort with other like-minded CEOs or companies doing similar kinds of things. We've developed an employee survey that as a third party we administer with companies, and it accesses a fair amount of information about an employee's work experience, and then also tries to capture information about their personal experiences as well. So many of you have seen, I'm sure, the crisis in childcare that's affecting working people all around, myself included, issues that people have making their housing payments. And so if a company considers, if they know that 30% of their workforce is housing insecure, how might that affect what they do? And so we'll get some of that information and share those results to the company. Separately, an employer can choose to work with a tool that we've partnered with an entity called Working Metrics to deploy at companies. This was founded at the Aspen Institute. It uses readily accessible data that's captured in an Excel spreadsheet to measure company performance, and then they've benchmarked companies by industry using Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Companies can use this tool over time, quarterly or semi-annually, to track their progress. And some of the reports from Working Metrics provide information about the job growth within a company, earnings, retention, measuring the benefits that a company provides against others within the same industry. And then it provides that information both by gender and by race. And you're looking initially at 2 points in time. We're starting with Q4 of 2019 and Q4 of 2016 to see what your baseline data is. And you can take that data, set goals for yourself moving forward, and then make some changes, the practices you'll implement to try to improve your scores on these reports. Using both the survey and this metrics tool, what we're looking to do is to create a community-wide dashboard that tells a story about Cincinnati companies overall. Then we'll make practice recommendations to companies. So we've done extensive research to find which companies have shown progress in advancing people's economic mobility inclusive diversity, equity, and inclusion practices within a workforce. We've added some things specific for companies to consider for COVID-19. And this is where we're looking for companies to say, we are interested in doing 1 or 2 new things to build upon where we currently are and to move forward. There are more than 120, as I mentioned, and we have partnerships with many local organizations that can help provide new sources of talent or specific training modules, other kinds of leadership programs to help a company meet their needs and reach their goals. We create a customized report that gives each company the information about why we're making these practice recommendations and what it looks like, and we'll be building our own evidence base over time. So this is an example of a practice that companies could do around creating more flexible schedules. The GAP has had a tremendous success in adjusting their, I can hear someone very loudly on a phone call or something, and I'm so sorry. It's difficult for me. Okay, there is evidence and information to be able to share with the company about how it works, and then we'll be building our own evidence base. So this is the time we believe we want to take this moment, and we want to get companies onto the movement to adopt inclusive capitalism practices across the region. We know that many companies are doing some really tremendous things, and we want to acknowledge and recognize them for doing that, and then build upon that as we move forward and get more and more companies who are ready, willing, and able to take this approach. And what we're doing right now is a rather soft launch where we're talking with companies individually and business groups, getting them committed and starting to work with us, and we'll roll out more publicly later this fall. So Darren and I also have the opportunity to partner together so that some of the Minority Business Accelerator firms will work with the Workforce Innovation Center. And I know some of you might have seen some of the other chamber's other diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's framed as Diverse by Design, where we put on a few key events like a diversity symposium each year. We have a leadership program called Building Cultural Competence, which is something that, say, the Workforce Innovation Center could recommend to executives at other companies to engage in, as well as networking events across the region.
To be commended. It's quite impressive. And I know we've been inspired at GLI to bring something similar to fruition. So we do have a few questions for you, some questions that have been pre-submitted. Unfortunately, we seem to be having some challenges with the chat function today. But I know a lot of people have my cell, so feel free to text me questions if you want me to ask Audrey and Darren these questions. So can one or both of you describe what the most surprising lesson learned as you launched this program was? What were you most surprised by as you took on this important work?
You want to go first, Audrey? Or? Yeah, I would say most surprised. It's interesting. So, as I mentioned, when I relocated to the Cincinnati region, I was not new to this space. And I think the largest, if you will, most significant surprise, but in a positive way, that I also think is critical to this work is the corporate commitment. I have seen in many other communities, just to be frank, a lot of lip service with respect to the intentionality and the commitment to diversify one's supply chain, because that is not an easy call. That is a situation where it's a very difficult decision for an organization to literally disrupt their supply chain. And so the origins of the accelerator to this day were literally led by our corporate leaders. The board of the accelerator consisted of the CEOs of our corporate leaders, and they brought their peers to the table and held their peers accountable. And one other real quick piece that I think is also super important, and that is the intentionality to actually house this work within the chamber. There are countless examples of minorities serving initiatives and programs that are, if you will, on the outside, trying to knock their way in. But when you are literally part of where the mainstream business activity is, you're part of the board meeting every month, the visibility, the access, and not to mention the responsibility and the ownership of the initiative by the chamber, as opposed to it being a non-business entity, if you will, out in the community, really matters. And so we're now looking at 17 years and running, which I think speaks to that corporate commitment.
On the side of the Workforce Innovation Center, I'd say over this summer, where we have reevaluated our approach, the consulting practice that we're building, how and why, and we had that moment of, will anybody care about this anymore? And we have been pleasantly surprised by the number of companies who are seeking us out to help them understand who they are, what they do, how they can be better. And I would say the same, emphasize Darren's point that the fact that we are housed within the chamber, focused on solving business problems, and to speak to something that Conrad said, this is not a shaming of companies about where they have been before. This is a meeting companies where they are, and it is trying to help them along the journey to adopt more inclusive approaches and to build and ultimately create more equitable outcomes for everybody in the community, while still businesses have the opportunity to meet their business needs and to thrive. So in that way, we're able to meet business needs and still also do really important community work at the same time.
Excellent. This next question is for you, Audrey. How transparent is the benchmarking, and where is the pressure to drive company results? You mentioned it's not from shaming. Where is that pressure, and how transparent are the benchmarks?
I only heard part of that question. Could you repeat it again? I'm so sorry.
Sure. How transparent are the benchmarks, and where is the pressure to accomplish them? If it's not about company shaming, how is that pressure applied?
Well, it's good old-fashioned peer pressure, quite frankly. What we're trying to do is really encourage companies to be their best selves because other companies are trying to be their best selves. So this gives you the competitive advantage. That's why we want this to be driven by companies who are motivated on their own. We're building a public campaign in which we will be recognizing companies for doing this work. And essentially, we know this to be true, that companies want to see themselves on the list. Are you on the list? Are you engaged in doing this work, or are you not? And that this will be one of those things that will drive companies to make changes. And so we're in the discussion around a formal certification process. You know, the LEED certified buildings is the LEED standard. It's a gold standard. How can we do that for companies and their human capital practices across the region? And how can we do that in ways that are really intentional? So for example, we've got a great company in Cincinnati. It's called Nehemiah Manufacturing. They are a consumer packaged goods company that creates a number of things for Procter & Gamble. And they built their company from the ground up, hiring almost exclusively citizens returning from the criminal justice system. And so they do a great job of telling their story. They give people the opportunity to advance. I mean, they're changing people's lives. They have social workers on staff so that people can get their needs met. They have expanded and have purchased an apartment building where they provide rent at below market rates for people who need a place to live, and they're furnishing those for people. So, you know, we talk about what Nehemiah Manufacturing is doing, and their CEO, Dan Myers, on my advisory board. Really tremendous, awesome work. And we want to hold them up, and we want other companies who could do similar things to emulate them. But we also know that lots of companies can't do all of that, can't build a company culture from the ground up in the same way because of restrictions, say, in the financial industry or in healthcare, can't hire citizens with certain criminal records, aren't necessarily ready to do something like hire a full-time social worker on their staff that can help their employees navigate their challenges. And that's okay. We do believe companies can start right where they are. Like we said, if you need to shift schedules to make them more equitable and working for working parents, that could be something that would begin you on that journey. Or let's say you want to hire more intentionally from different community groups to increase the diversity of your workforce, or veterans, or people with disabilities. I mean, there's any number of things that a company could do right now, and it's not a shaming, but just an opportunity to see how they might be able to grow.
Excellent, thank you. And I think this is a good follow-up question for both of you, Audrey and Darren. As we're talking about how to build viable, solvent, and financially secure minority-owned businesses that are part of the larger ecosystem and really build an inclusive economy, how did you talk to white leaders in Cincinnati and really help frame for them the importance of the work in a way that didn't feel charitable or didn't, consider it like a social justice imperative? What did those?
Great question. I'll jump in here. This speaks to, there's an aspect of one of my slides that talked about the business case for inclusion. And so that is core to the work. We've been fortunate that organizations like Procter & Gamble and others have really driven that point home to really speak to how a diverse supply chain every time will outthink, out-innovate, outperform a non-diverse supply chain. It creates greater competition within the supply chain, pricing strategies. And so we frankly only approach this work from a business competitiveness standpoint. When we are working with our minority entrepreneurs, it is about the strength of their value proposition. It is about the strength of them being able to compete, their ability to scale. And so this is not a zero-sum game, meaning that if one is winning, one must be losing, meaning that the more minority businesses that we scale up, frankly, the more investment opportunities are created for people of all races, the more consumer spending happens in the region for everyone. And so from an economic perspective, you're talking about turning on economic engines that you don't have operating today. And so it is purely, from our standpoint, a business and economic imperative. And we're fortunate that we have now many examples of that to give people just example after example of why that works.
I would add that some of the conversations that we're having right now around how can white CEOs asking questions about how can I make my company more inclusive, and sharing feedback, like we've done some focus groups with our employees of color, and we're actually not doing a very good job, and that some senior leaders are shocked about this. And some senior leaders are fearful that they're going to make mistakes, and they don't want to do that. And so some of the conversations I'm having with people are about being courageous in this time and understanding that this is an imperfect system that requires vulnerability and courage, and also the willingness to make mistakes, to apologize, and to move forward, learning something new. And so, and to the extent that I can, I'm also encouraging other white people, myself included, to keep learning and understanding and growing, because we can't do this big transformational change within systems if we ourselves are also not transforming and changing and improving, understanding the world differently than we might have before.
I'd like to, even if I could, add one additional piece to that, that I think without question is also driving the business case in such a way that is just, front and center. So it is now no longer a secret, if you will, that the country is becoming increasingly more diverse. And so what that also means is that the very customer base of our corporate leaders is changing. And those corporations that demonstrate commitment and sensitivity to a changing customer base will absolutely create greater market share for themselves than those that choose not to. And so when your customer changes, one must rethink how you approach a shifting customer base. And so depending on the report that you read around this being a majority minority nation in the next 15 years or so, some reports even sooner, that clearly just drives a shifting landscape of consumers, buying patterns, et cetera. And so all of that ties into a business strategy that one that is thinking in a more inclusive framework will outperform.
Excellent point. Thank you. So had a question about government involvement here. Was local or state government involved in this effort either at the beginning or are they now?
Good idea.
Yes. So when I spoke about the child poverty rate, the mayor of the city of Cincinnati was involved in the group that led the effort called the Child Poverty Collaborative. And I mentioned that it was his office that invited us to participate, to apply for the grant that we received with the Economic Mobility Initiative. And so we've got great support in the mayor, our local support in Cincinnati, especially on that work, and even more broadly with other elected officials. And Darren, I specifically to the foundation of the MBA.
Yeah, certainly the city was and is involved, if for no other sort of direct impact, just as additional support, advocacy. How do we work together, even with city contracts and things of that nature? So the mayor, from inception to certainly today, has been very much involved. We also serve on economic inclusion committees at the city level and county level, and so there's a lot of purposeful interaction and engagement in the public sector.
And is there government funding involved?
So not for our work.
Not for ours either.
Great. And another question here. From year to year of the program, how have business needs evolved and how have the challenges evolved? And do you have any kind of expectations of possible strategic changes that may need to occur as a result of the current state of our economy, specifically the pandemic?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And frankly, even pre-pandemic, it's interesting from a trend perspective, when we think about, as I mentioned, shifting demographics and such, that has now kind of no longer a secret, if you will. So we've seen a lot of corporations. It's frankly hard to find organizations, particularly large corporations, that don't have some aspect of a diversity and inclusion plan today, which in part is rooted in some form of approach around supplier diversity. So what that means is there's more of a hunt for more diverse suppliers than there has really ever been. However, at the very same time, to your point about change, corporations have been concurrently consolidating their supply chain. And the very nature of consolidation means that it sort of flies in the face of small business, disproportionately minority business, because fewer vendors remain in the supply chain. So those that do remain have to take on more scale, more capacity, have more infrastructure. So that is an undeniable trend, which is also now leading us to create a fund that I mentioned at the outset to provide equity capital and equity-like capital, which remains to this day nationally the most significant capital gap for minority entrepreneurs. If you look at most, darn near all, access to capital initiatives over the years have always been about debt. And so we're really trying to drive more of the conversation to equity, which then by design drives scale. Equity capital by design is drawn to more scalable enterprises, which is now also feeding strategies like joint ventures and acquisitions. And so that is a very necessary next step that we're very much involved in. And also just trying to also do a better job of partnering with our tech-based ecosystem as well. And so I think partnering, again, be that joint ventures, et cetera, is going to be one of the driving changes that we're trying to stay on top of.
I would like to add to Darren's point about the changing nature of the consumer base becoming more diverse. I think what we also see in younger generations is a greater understanding and desire to buy from companies that they believe in, and the Just Capital released its pandemic report about the top corporations and their response to the pandemic. Some of you might have seen that. I think those kinds of rankings matter more now, because as we have seen how quickly middle class families lost their jobs and were so financially insecure that they needed to be in food pantry lines. I think about the piece in Texas where it's just miles and miles of cars and people waiting for food because they couldn't get enough themselves. Companies need to see themselves as a part of that solution to this through the things they do with their own employees, and how they live their brand and purpose, or how it even evolves to be more responsive and to make capitalism work for others. There's this trend to get away from the idea that shareholder value is the only thing that companies need to maximize, that capitalism was really designed to support customers, employees, the community, and shareholders. And that's what we're trying to get back to by a company's own volition and as part of their long-term business strategy. So I think the pandemic and this increased awareness of racial injustice has just created an urgency for that companies who don't take this moment and really try to change and evolve and adapt really might not make it long term.
I'd like to add to that real quickly as well, specific to the pandemic. That certainly the pandemic is exacerbating, but there has long been for those of us that have been focused on the minority business space, and related to my point about scale, just the disproportionate number of small micro enterprises in the minority business community, that what we're trying to do certainly in this time of crisis, even though we focus on those that have the ability to scale, but even partnering with our other minority serving groups to, of course, drive as much awareness to just national grant dollars and all the things that are happening out there. But at the same time, encouraging entrepreneurs to think about, even at the micro enterprise level, partnering, bartering. There's a lot of just partnering activities when you have just multiple, shops and such that are on the same strip that could be doing work together. And so there's just a different mindset that I think this is certainly creating. And we are, with our core work at the Accelerator, pretty unapologetically focused on scale, because and not at the expense of or to undermine smaller businesses, but we have such a gap with respect to the kinds of minority firms that we have seen in our portfolio, that because they have size and scale, they go on, the CEOs go on to become board leaders of the Chamber, of the Convention and Visitors Bureau, of United Way, give back in significant ways philanthropically. We have an entrepreneur, for example, that has a large scale concrete construction business that has literally put over 500 returning citizens to work that are disproportionately people of color, because they have the wherewithal and the vehicle in their business by which to do so. And so the economic ripple effect of growing larger scale firms is critical as a component to the overall strategy.
Thank you, Darren and Audrey. I think that's a great ending note for us today. As many of you noticed, I spoke on behalf of Papa John's earlier, but I am not from Papa John's. So we're going to give Marvin Bouquet an opportunity to say a few words. Marvin is with Papa John's. Papa John's is the presenting sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series, which is what we are participating in today. So Marvin, would you like to say a few words about the importance of DE&I at Papa John's?
Great, thank you, and I'll keep it very short. I hope you can all hear me okay. Unfortunately, I'm trying to work with technology like many of you. I've got 3 screens going on, and I cannot figure out which camera I should be looking at right now. So if I'm not looking at you, please don't take it personally at all. Wonderful presentations and great discussion there by Conrad, Darren, and Audrey. Definitely, we are very appreciative, and in this time, trying to have engaging conversations, you guys did a wonderful job in really keeping our attention, but also talking about something that is so key and important to all of us in the work we do today. I know I, for one, definitely took a lot of learnings out of what you shared. For Papa John's, we've been on a journey on diversity, equity, and inclusion for a little more than 2 years now. It's so important to the success of our business that we've decided to make creating a culture of leaders who believe in diversity, inclusivity, and winning the #1 strategic priority for the company. As the fight for racial justice continues in our communities and in our country, we're trying to aspire to create the kind of culture in our company we'd like to see in the rest of the world, and a culture that we can all be proud of. Our purpose that we created last year, one of the first things says, we love pizza and we believe it brings us all together. And these kinds of conversations are ways that we're hoping to use our platform to bring all types of people, stakeholders from both internally and externally, to have difficult conversations, but to use that platform to figure out real solutions that can be sustainable. So on behalf of Papa John's, we thank you so much for allowing us to be a sponsor.
Thanks so much, Marvin. As the Chief People Officer for Papa John's International, Marvin has been very hands-on in this work, and we appreciate his involvement with GLI. Thank you again to Darren and to Audrey for being with us today, and thank you to our sponsors, Papa John's International, Brown-Forman, Humana, Yum Brands, Oliver Group, Morales Group Staffing, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Tops Magazine. This is important work, and GLI is all in on addressing racial equity and supporting our minority businesses and talent. Our next conversation on racial inequity in business will focus on workforce development and barriers, and will be held on September 2nd from 9 to 10 a.m. So please go to www.greaterlouisville.com to register for that and find out more about our speaker. Also, if you are a member of the Business Council to End Racism, please take a 15-minute break and join us at 1:45 for our discussion. We will be talking a lot about certifications, and you should have the Zoom registration information if you are one of the Business Council members. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you virtually again soon. Have a wonderful day.